Velkommen og god kveld alle. Here making another video, and this one is going to be about the pagan calendar, the Norse pagan calendar. So I just made a video about the summer solstice and how the pagan Norse would have celebrated that and what it means. And I spoke a little bit about months, and I want to go into a little bit more detail about this so you all know what I'm talking about in future videos. And I just want to make 2 points about it that are very important. So the one thing we have to realize is that people of that time would have had different calendars and different months around the world, not just around the world, just within their own region. They would have had different calendars and months. Today, in 2020, of course, we use the Gregorian calendar, and it's pretty recognized throughout the whole world, and that's what we all use because we're so connected. We're just so globalized, and we have to find a way to make the dates match with each other. The different countries have different calendars, like China and things like that, but we're all on the same Gregorian calendar, pretty much, just to keep things organized. See, back then, there was no organization like that. People were not as connected as we are today. They weren't anywhere close to as connected as we are today. People lived in their region, and maybe they didn't ever see anything else. They didn't ever meet anyone else. So there was no need to have a universal calendar there. So we can find maybe in Denmark, we see one calendar, and then just a couple hundred miles south in Germany, we see another calendar, and then we go a couple hundred miles west to England, and we see a total different calendar. And not just the month names were different, but the whole concept of time was different. So some calendars were based off of the moon, some calendars were based off the sun and the solstices. So some marked their start of the year at different times, and some calendars even had days different, had a different concept of the day. So one example of that is some of the Germanic tribes, as Tacitus wrote. He came across other Germanic tribes, and he noticed that they thought the new day started at sunset. So their new day started when the sun went down, totally different. So calendars would have been totally different in different parts of Europe, even from tribe to tribe, living very close to each other. So there's no way of knowing. There probably was not one Norse common calendar. There were probably many different ones. And the second point that you need to realize is people did not really print out calendars and keep them on their fridge like we do today. They just didn't have calendars like that. They didn't need it. I'm sure that doesn't mean that they didn't have a concept of time and dates and the year and things like that. That's not at all what I say. And some scholars, they annoy me a bit when they think that. They think that the Greeks and the Romans had calendars and had a good concept of time and the universe. 2,000 years before the Norse people did, which is just absolute crap. The Norse had a very good concept of time. It's just that we don't find calendars laying around in their houses in archaeological finds. Well, one, because the Christians probably burned them all, like they did everything else. But two, that calendars weren't really needed around this time. They didn't, like I said, they didn't have them hang up on their walls, anything like that. They didn't need them. Today in 2020, we need calendars to tell what day it is, but back then, they could open their door, step outside, look at the stars, and they could tell you exactly what day it was, exactly what month it was, how far away the summer solstice was. They knew all of that for sure. They had nothing else to do at nighttime besides tell stories and sit around the campfire and look up at the stars and the moon and see patterns there. So they absolutely had a good idea of time, even though we don't find a lot of archaeological records of actual calendars there. And Scandinavia would have been the same. All records of the native calendars used in pre-Christian times would have been burned and destroyed. But there are some things we can learn about the main calendar that was used and that we look at as the main Norse or Viking calendar, and that's called actually the Icelandic calendar, which looks just like this. So you've probably seen that one before, and this one was first in use in about the 900s. Most people agree. It was in use by then, and it was actually used all the way until the 1800s in Iceland. But we see that calendar actually looks pretty similar to the calendar today, and also similar to the Julian calendar that the Christians and the rest of Europe would have used back then. And most people agree that this calendar, this Icelandic calendar, looks pretty much the same, 12 months based off the sun and the winter solstice, each month lasting 30 days and so on. That standard thing was influenced by the Julian calendar. That all the Christians in Europe were using pretty much at that time. And why? This was because the Scandinavians were starting to connect. Like I said earlier, the more people connect, the more they have a need for a universal calendar. Because in the 900s, the Scandinavians were absolutely not Christian, but they let their calendar be influenced by this Julian calendar, because they needed to collaborate, and they needed to have a bit more solid understanding of time with the Christian people that they were coming in contact with. And the Vikings at this time, especially, they weren't just raiding. They weren't just raiding and causing war on people. They were trading. They were settling places. The Vikings settled all over the place. They settled in France. They settled in England. They owned England at one point. England was a Danish kingdom. And they traded with people. They met people at certain places. They celebrated holidays together. They were neighbors. So the Scandinavians probably had a different calendar, and then the English had the Julian calendar, and then they assimilated it and made it more similar to the Julian calendar, and that's what we see here in this Icelandic calendar. So this was definitely not, in my opinion, definitely not the original Norse calendar. There probably was no original Norse calendar, but there were probably many different ones. But they used this one as kind of an assimilation, to adapt to the Julian calendar, so they could better organize dates and things with the Christian people they were coming in contact with. So this was definitely not a pagan calendar, but it did have a whole lot of pagan everything really. It was a pagan calendar, just kind of assimilated to the Christian Julian calendar. So a few things were different, and reflect that pagan tradition and that pagan view of the year and time. So a couple things to just mention about this calendar, a couple things that made it different from other calendars at that time, and the calendars that the Christians were using. First one. The year started at a different time. The year start was right after Halloween. That was the very start of the year. It wasn't in New Year's in January like we have today. It was right after Halloween, and I'm going to explain why that was their new year in another video, because that's a long subject. But yeah, it started then. So there were only 2 seasons in this one as well. And that was a winter and summer. It was skammadegi, which meant short days, so that's the winter, and nattilisi, that means nightless days, so that was the summer. So they only had 2 seasons when everyone else thought of it as the regular 4. So each month, that's another point, each month started on the same day of the week. And that's a cool thing that we're going to look at in another video as well. But they liked it when each month had the same day at the same time, the same weekday as well, and I'll explain why that is also in another video. But to make this happen, of course, the days don't exactly match up to be the year of 365 days. So in this Icelandic calendar, they added a few extra days, depending on if it was a leap year or not. It could be anywhere from 4 to 11 days added to the calendar. Most people agree. And these 4 to 11 days was called Summarauki. And that's sometimes considered as another month, but either way, they had to add those days just to account for the missing days of the that they were missing of the year. And as we see in the Icelandic calendar there. So a lot of the months seem to have old gods' names linked to it, and also they had to do with the type of year or type of work that would be happening, like a haustamolnader, harvest month, and heyanir, the haymaking month, basically, and that's about it. That's the five main differences that the Icelandic calendar had with the Julian calendar. And this calendar was actually in use in Iceland until the 1800s. So long after, pretty recent actually, and even in Iceland today, we still see that they still use this calendar for some holidays that they have, like the start of summer. They base it on their old Icelandic calendar, and Thorablut is another one that's also calculated by this calendar. I think there's more, but I'll do a video on that later too, I guess. So I'm going to look a lot more at this calendar and the months and holidays and what they mean. And we also have a lot more, much older evidence of calendars and how the Norse and Germanic people would have viewed time and the year. But it's mostly just on staves and little runic inscriptions. Like I said, they didn't print out a calendar and hang it on their fridge like we do today. So I just made this video to give you a little insight about how the typical calendar that we actually view as Norse, this Icelandic calendar, is not actually fully Norse pagan. Without doubt, the calendar is just an assimilation that they tried to assimilate to the Julian calendar so they could just organize time and meetings a little bit better with the English or other peoples that they were in contact with. So this was definitely not the original Norse pagan one, but it definitely has roots in that. But like I said, there is no Norse pagan calendar. We won't find that. It's not anywhere. We won't find any Germanic calendar. But what some people have actually done is they have recreated the Old Norse calendar, something that would have come before this Icelandic calendar used in the 900s, that was completely pagan with no influence from the Julian calendar or any other outside sources. This would have been the actual calendar that the Norse people would have used in pagan times before the Viking Age, and possibly even further. Just remember that we don't have any evidence of that exact calendar. It's just a recreation, and so those are the months that I will also speak about whenever I refer to months. Even though it's just a recreation, I like to use that because we have to be allowed to recreate some things and get a bit creative and see what things would have been like when we don't know, because as you forget sometimes, we recreate a lot of things. We recreated Proto-Germanic. That's a full-on language that we refer to a lot, and it's basically a recreated language. We don't have enough records of the full language. Actually, we just have some little inscriptions and evidence here and there. So some scholars are able to come up with theories about how that language would have looked. And that's what I like to do with the calendar as well. We look at the evidence and we look at things, and that's what people have done. If you want to know a book on that, it's a guy called Vegard Solheim, and I think it's only a Norwegian book. It's called Våre Tradisjoner. I'm not sure if he has an English translation yet, but that's probably the best book about pre-pagan times of year and festivals and traditions and things like that. And this is one of the guys. I don't know if he actually created that construction of the old Norse calendar. Because there's a few people who have done it too, but he uses it in his book, and that's what I'm also going to use in my videos, just to play around with it, have some fun, and it does make a lot of sense what they're doing, how they've recreated these months. So I'll explain all about that in another video. See you next time.